The morning Helen Beckett set her bread on that old crate at the crossroads of Caldwell Junction, Kansas, she made herself a promise she whispered so quietly even the prairie wind could not carry it away. She would not cry, not in front of the boys, not in front of strangers, and not in front of God himself, who had already taken enough from her without also taking her dignity. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were beginning to shake off the gray coat of winter with something that almost looked like hope. Though hope was a commodity Helen had learned to regard with the same cautious suspicion, she applied to unfamiliar horses and men who smiled too easily. The grass along the roadside had gone a pale, tentative green, and the sky above stretched wide and indifferent in the way that only the Kansas sky could manage, vast enough to make a person feel small and free all at once, which was a contradiction Helen had long since stopped trying to make peace with. She had baked through the night. 4 loaves, then 6, then 8, because sleep had abandoned her weeks ago, and her hands needed something to do while her mind worked through the arithmetic of survival. The flour had come from the last of Thomas's account at Maggart's General Store, an account the proprietor had informed her, with something between sympathy and impatience, would not carry past the end of the month. Thomas Beckett had been dead for 7 months. He had died in September when a horse spooked on the trail between Caldwell Junction and Wichita, and Thomas, who had never been a particularly graceful rider, had gone over the animal's head and struck the hard-packed earth at exactly the wrong angle. The doctor said it was fast. Helen had held that word in her chest ever since, turning it over like a river stone, grateful for it and furious at it in equal measure. She had 2 boys. Samuel was 9, a serious child with his father's dark eyebrows and a habit of watching the world from a slight distance, as if he were taking careful notes. Ellis was 6, all loose limbs and noise and a grin that appeared at the most inappropriate moments, and that Helen loved so completely it sometimes frightened her. They were both asleep in the wagon she had borrowed from her neighbor, old Mrs. Hargrove, a woman of 70 who had buried 2 husbands and a son, and who gave advice like other people gave, weather forecasts constant, unrequested, and frequently accurate. "You sell that bread at the crossroads, Mrs. Hargrove had told her the previous evening, standing at Helen's door with her hands folded and her eyes direct. Drovers come through there on their way north, cattle outfits stopping at the junction, settlers heading west. They are all hungry, Helen, and a good loaf of bread is a thing a man will pay for when he is far from home." Helen had set out before dawn because the wagon took time, and because she wanted the best position, right at the corner where the 2 dirt roads crossed, and where a rider coming from any direction would see her first. She had arranged the loaves on the crate with care, covered them with a clean cloth, and written the price on a small piece of board with charcoal. 8 cents a loaf. It was fair. She knew it was fair because she had thought about it for 3 days and prayed about it for 2. The first hour passed without anyone. A dust devil spun across the road 100 yards south and dissolved. 2 meadowlarks fought over something in the grass. Samuel woke up and came to sit beside her on the stool she had brought, and he did not say anything, which was one of the things she loved most about him. He simply sat with her and watched the empty road, and she felt, for a moment, that she was not entirely alone in the enormous silence of the morning. The first customer was a drover named Hutchins, a weathered man in his 50s who looked at the bread, looked at Helen, looked at the price, and then counted out his coins with the deliberate care of a man who knew the exact weight of what he was spending. He bought 2 loaves without a word of conversation and rode north. Helen closed her fist around those 16 cents and pressed them against her palm until the metal was warm. 2 more customers came by mid-morning, a family in a wagon heading west who bought 1 loaf and commented that it smelled wonderful, and a young cowhand who could not have been more than 18 and who paid with a crumpled bill and seemed grateful for the change. By noon she had sold 5 loaves. 3 remained. That was when Jeremiah Brenner came riding in from the east. She heard the horse before she saw the man, a good, steady rhythm that spoke of an animal well cared for, and a rider who was not in a hurry, which in Helen's experience was the mark of someone who either had no particular trouble chasing him or had made his peace with whatever trouble there was. The horse was a big roan gelding, well-muscled across the shoulders, and the man in the saddle was tall, even-mounted, with a build that suggested he had done years of hard work and had done it willingly. He wore a dark brown hat with the brim curved exactly right, and his coat was trail dusty but good quality, the kind of coat a man bought to last and then wore until it did. He slowed when he saw her. Not in the cautious way that some men slowed when they saw a woman alone, gauging, calculating, but in the way that a decent person slowed when they noticed something that required their full attention. He brought the roan to a stop a few feet from the crate, and he looked at the bread, and then he looked at Helen, and his eyes were the kind of brown that made you think of creek water in autumn, clear and warm and moving. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Helen said. She kept her voice level. She had been keeping her voice level for 7 months, and she was very practiced at it. "That bread fresh baked?" he asked, nodding toward the crate. "Baked last night. Still good," she said. He swung down from the horse with the ease of someone who had been climbing in and out of saddles all his life, and he looped the reins around the fence post at the edge of the crossroads, a post that had been put there by someone who had the same practical idea decades ago, and he came to look at the loaves properly, the way a person looks at something they actually intend to buy rather than something they are merely curious about. "How many you got left?" he asked. "3," Helen said. He looked at them for a moment, then he said, "I'll take all 3. Helen blinked. She had not expected that. "All 3? "Yes, ma'am." He reached into his coat and produced his coin purse without any ceremony. 8 cents each, your sign says. "That is correct." He counted out 24 cents and placed them on the corner of the crate with a deliberateness that she found oddly respectful, not sliding them across or dropping them, but setting them down as if the transaction deserved a moment of gravity. She took the coins and wrapped the 3 loaves in the cloth she had ready. "You pass through here regular?" he asked, and it was a simple question, the kind a man asks when he wants to know if a thing will be there again, but there was something in his tone that made Helen pay attention to it. "I am hoping to," she said carefully. He picked up the wrapped bread and looked at her again, not impolitely. There was nothing in his look that made her want to step back, but it was a thorough look, the kind that a person gives when they are genuinely trying to understand something, and Helen felt the unusual sensation of being seen rather than simply looked at. "What time do you set up?" he asked. "I was here before 7 this morning," she said. He nodded slowly, as if that answer meant something more than the words themselves. "Good bread is hard to come by on the trail," he said. "I appreciate it." He touched the brim of his hat, took his bread, mounted up with the same unhurried ease with which he had dismounted, and rode west. Helen watched him go. Beside her, Samuel looked up from the spot of grass he had been examining and said, without particular emotion, "He bought a lot of bread." "He did," Helen agreed. She gathered her empty crate, counted her coins, 58 cents for the morning, which was not a fortune but was something real and earned and hers. And she helped Samuel wake Ellis, who complained about the wagon boards being hard, and then forgot entirely that he had been complaining when a jackrabbit crossed the road in front of them, and he spent the next 10 minutes constructing an elaborate theory about where it was going. That evening she baked 8 more loaves. Her arms ached, but she did not stop, and she thought about 8 cents and 24 cents and 58 cents, and the amount of flour she could buy if she sold everything tomorrow, and she thought, briefly and without meaning to, about clear brown eyes and an unhurried horse. He was back the next morning. She was still setting up the crate when she heard the roan's steady hoofbeats coming from the direction of town, and she straightened and waited, and there he was, Jeremiah Brenner, arriving at the crossroads of Caldwell Junction with the morning sun at his back, and what appeared to be a genuine lack of embarrassment about the fact that he had clearly ridden specifically to her small bread stand at the side of the road. "Morning," he said, dismounting again. "Good morning," Helen said, and then, because she could not help it, "You are here early." "I was up early," he said, which explained nothing and somehow explained everything. He looked at the bread on the crate. She had laid out 8 loaves that morning, more confident after yesterday's sales, and he studied them with what she was beginning to recognize as his habitual thoroughness. "Same price?" he asked. "Same price," she confirmed. He bought 4 loaves. Then he straightened and he said, "I have a question, if you do not mind." Helen looked at him steadily. "You may ask it. Do you bake every kind of bread or only the white?" He gestured toward the loaves with a slight tilt of his head. She almost laughed. It was so unexpected, not the question she had been bracing herself for, whatever that question might have been. She said, "I bake rye as well. And sometimes cornbread when I have the meal for it." He nodded. "Could I put in a request for tomorrow if you are going to be here?" "What kind of request?" "Rye, if it is not too much trouble. My mother used to make rye." He said it plainly, without sentimentality, the way a person states a fact that happens to also contain a feeling they are not ashamed of. "I can do that," Helen said. "Thank you." He paid 32 cents exact, and then he did not immediately leave. He stood by the crate with his 4 loaves under his arm and looked at the empty road to the north. "You are out here alone," he observed, not accusingly, almost carefully. "My sons are in the wagon," she said. He glanced toward the wagon where the canvas cover was still closed, Ellis's small boots just visible at the back edge. He looked back at Helen. "Is there a Mr. Beckett?" he asked, and she could tell he had debated asking it. "There was," she said. She did not look away when she said it. His expression shifted. Not to pity, she had seen enough pity in 7 months to recognize it from across a room, but to something more like gravity, a settling, a taking in of information that mattered. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her slightly because she had been thanking people for their condolences for 7 months and had long since stopped meaning it. "How long has it been?" he asked, and then immediately, "Forgive me. That is not my business." 7 months, she said. She had answered it before he finished apologizing. He absorbed that. The morning was quiet around them. A mockingbird was doing something complicated in a nearby cottonwood. "My name is Jeremiah Brenner," he said. "I am staying in Caldwell Junction for a time. I do some cattle work for an outfit called the Dunmore Operation east of here." "Helen Beckett," she said. He held out his hand and she shook it, which was not something that all men offered a woman in 1878, and she noted it. "I will be back tomorrow," he said. "If you are here with that rye." "I will be here," she said. He rode away and she watched the road where he had gone for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then Samuel appeared at her elbow. The boy moved silently, a habit that had occasionally startled her nearly out of her boots, and said, "He came back." "He did," Helen said. "What did he want?" "Bread," Helen said. Samuel considered this with the gravity appropriate to the situation. "He asked a lot of questions for somebody who just wanted bread," the boy said. Helen looked down at her older son, at his serious dark eyes and the way he held himself even at 9 years old with a kind of considered watchfulness, and she said, "Yes, I suppose he did." She sold 5 more loaves that morning to other travelers and went home with 68 cents and a shopping list for the general store, and a head full of thoughts she did not examine too closely. She baked the rye bread that evening. The days that followed developed a rhythm that Helen had not expected, and that she found herself, quietly and with some caution, depending upon. She was at the crossroads each morning, her loaves laid out on the crate in the gathering light, Samuel usually beside her, Ellis more often than not asleep in the wagon until the sun was well up. Other customers came, drovers, settlers, the occasional businessman making his way between towns, a Mexican trader named Sandoval who passed through twice a week and who always bought 2 loaves and always paid 3 cents more than the price, and when she tried to give him change said, in very precise English, "I know the cost of good bread, Mrs. Beckett." She appreciated Sandoval enormously. And Jeremiah Brenner came every morning. Not always first. Sometimes she had already sold 2 or 3 loaves by the time his roan appeared on the road, but always before noon, and always with questions. He seemed constitutionally incapable of completing a transaction without also satisfying some piece of his curiosity, and his curiosity, Helen discovered, was both extensive and genuine. He asked about her bread, not just what kind but how she learned to bake, which was from her mother in Missouri, who had learned from her mother in Ohio, a chain of flour-dusted women passing knowledge forward through time. He asked about the Crossroads, about the history of the junction, about the other traders and travelers she saw. He asked about Samuel and Ellis in a careful way that showed he understood that asking about a widow's children was not a simple thing. In return, and almost without noticing she was doing it, she asked about him. He was from Illinois originally, he told her one morning, leaning against the fence post while his roan waited with enviable patience. He had come west at 22, drawn by the cattle work and by something he called, without much elaboration, more room. He was 34 now, which put him 12 years ahead of Helen's 22, and he wore those years in the easy way of a man who had not wasted them, but also had not been gentle on himself. He had worked cattle in Texas, in Indian Territory carefully and respectfully, he noted, and in Kansas for the past 4 years. He did not own land, he said, with a tone that was neither pride nor shame but something more like honest accounting, but he had saved enough to be thinking about it. Thinking about it, Helen asked. I have been looking at some land east of the junction, he said. About 3 miles out, good grass, a creek that does not run dry in August. Thinking about farming. She could not quite picture it, but she was trying. Ranching, he said. Small scale, nothing like the Dunmore outfit, but something of my own, she nodded. She understood the desire to have something of one's own. It was, in fact, the core of why she was standing at this crossroads every morning with flour under her fingernails. 2 weeks into this arrangement, Ellis finally decided that Jeremiah Brenner deserved his personal assessment. Ellis had been watching from the wagon for the full 2 weeks with the intense concentration of a 6-year-old who is gathering evidence. He had asked his mother approximately 40 questions about the man, whether he had a horse, yes, a roan, whether the horse had a name, she did not know, whether Jeremiah was a cowboy, yes, of a sort, whether he was going to keep coming back, she could not say for certain, and whether cowboys ate bread, apparently this one did. Then one morning Ellis climbed down from the wagon in his bare feet, walked directly up to Jeremiah Brenner and said without preamble, "My pa is dead." Helen's heart did something complicated. She started to say something, she was not sure what, but Jeremiah was already crouching down to Ellis's level, which put him eye to eye with the 6-year-old in a way that struck Helen as both natural and kind, and he said, "I heard that. I am sorry about your pa." Ellis considered him. "Were you ever somebody's pa?" "No," Jeremiah said. "Do you have a pa?" "I did. He died a while back." Ellis absorbed this information with the uncanny directness of young children. "Does it stop hurting?" Jeremiah looked at the boy steadily. He did not say yes, which would have been a lie. He did not say no, which would have been terrifying. He said, "It changes. It is different after a while. But I still think about him." He paused. "Do you think about yours?" "Every day," Ellis said in a voice that was too old for his face. "Good," Jeremiah said quietly. "That means you loved him." Ellis nodded once, apparently satisfied, and then said, "What is your horse's name?" "He does not have one yet," Jeremiah said. Ellis's eyebrows rose dramatically. "You have to name him," he said, with the urgency of someone who has just discovered a moral failing that must be corrected immediately. "You cannot just not name him." "You are right," Jeremiah said. "What would you call him?" "Red," Ellis said, immediately and without doubt. Jeremiah looked at his roan gelding, who was regarding them with equine serenity. "Red it is," he said. Helen, who had been watching this exchange from 2 feet away, felt something shift in her chest, not painfully, but with the particular ache of something that had been held very tightly, beginning, just slightly, to relax. Over the following weeks, the business at the Crossroads grew. Word spread the way it always does in small, interconnected communities, not through any deliberate advertising, but through the simple human mechanism of one person mentioning a thing to another. The drovers who bought her bread told other drovers. The settlers mentioned it at the next town. Even the stagecoach that ran through the junction 3 times a week began stopping, and the driver, a man named Pete Havorson with a magnificent mustache and a voice like a box of loose gravel, bought bread every single time and declared her cornbread the finest in the state of Kansas, which Helen suspected was an exaggeration but appreciated nonetheless. She expanded to 10 loaves, then 12. She brought a second crate. Samuel, who had inherited his father's methodical streak, began keeping a small ledger, a habit he had developed entirely on his own, without prompting, and that made Helen feel proud in a way that went beyond the practical, in which he recorded what sold and what did not, and what prices the customers seemed most willing to pay without hesitation. "We should do a honey loaf," Samuel said one evening, reviewing his ledger with the focused intensity of someone much older. Mr. Sandoval asked twice. "Honey costs money," Helen said. "Less than the bread makes back," Samuel said, and showed her his calculations. She looked at her 9-year-old son's careful arithmetic and said, "When did you get so smart?" "I was always smart," Samuel said, matter-of-factly and without conceit, in a way that so resembled his father that Helen had to look away for a moment. She started making the honey loaf. Jeremiah Brenner bought the first one. He said it was extraordinary, which she privately agreed with, and then he asked, because he always asked something, whether she had ever thought about expanding beyond the Crossroads. Selling to the hotel dining room in town, perhaps, or the rail camp that was setting up 10 miles south where the new spur line was going in. "The rail camp would need a lot of bread," Helen said. "They would," he agreed. "I know the foreman out there, man named Calhoun. I could introduce you if you wanted." Helen looked at him carefully. He was standing in his usual spot beside the fence post, hat in hand now because the morning had turned warm, his hair dark and slightly disheveled in a way that she had noticed made him look younger. He was looking at her with that direct, clear attention that she had come to know was simply the way he looked at things he was interested in, and she had long since stopped reading anything alarming into it. Instead, she had begun to recognize it as a thing she valued, that he gave her his genuine attention rather than a performance of it. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which was another thing she had come to value about him. He did not give quick answers to real questions. "Because it seems like something that would help you," he said. "And because Calhoun needs someone who can deliver reliably and on time, and you are the most reliable person at this crossroads." "You do not know many people at this crossroads," she pointed out. "I know you," he said, and it was simple and it was true, and it sat in the morning air between them like something solid. "All right," she said. "Introduce me to Calhoun." He arranged it for the following Saturday, and they rode out to the rail camp together, Helen in Mrs. Hargrove's wagon, Jeremiah on red beside her, and Calhoun turned out to be a barrel-shaped Irishman with a shrewd business sense and an impressive appetite who tasted Helen's bread, raised his eyebrows, and offered her a contract for 30 loaves 3 times a week, to be delivered on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Helen sat in that rail camp office, which was really a converted freight car, and looked at the contract Calhoun had written up in his large, careful hand, and she did the arithmetic in her head. She did not need a ledger for it. She had been running figures in her head since September, and she understood, in one clear and simple moment, that this was the difference between surviving and actually living. She signed the contract. Jeremiah, who had waited outside by the wagon, looked up when she came back out, and whatever he saw in her face made him smile, a real smile, not the polite expression he sometimes deployed for strangers but the one that reached all the way up to those creek-water eyes, and she thought, not for the first time and with slightly less alarm than she had experienced on previous occasions, that he had a very fine smile. "Good news?" he asked. "Very good news," she said. "Then we should celebrate," he said. "There is a decent dining room at the Caldwell Junction Hotel. Would you and the boys do me the honor of joining me for supper?" It was the first time he had asked anything that could be construed as social rather than commercial, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Helen took a moment, not because she did not know her answer, but because she had learned that it was worth letting important moments take their proper time. "The boys would enjoy that," she said. "And you?" he asked. "I would enjoy it as well," she said. They had supper at the hotel dining room that evening, at a table by the window that looked out over the main street of Caldwell Junction. Ellis ordered everything on the menu that he thought he might possibly want, and had to be diplomatically redirected. Samuel studied the menu with the same analytical attention he brought to his ledger, and ordered the thing with the best value ratio. Jeremiah ordered coffee and the beef, and answered approximately 30 questions from Ellis in the span of a single meal, covering topics including but not limited to how fast Red could run, whether Jeremiah had ever been in a real fight. He answered this one carefully. How many cows he had seen in his life, and whether he thought a man could train a jackrabbit to be a pet. Helen watched this and ate her food and felt something she had not felt in a long time, not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but something more like the sensation of weight being distributed more evenly, of not carrying everything alone. After supper, walking back through the warm spring evening to where the wagon was tied, with Ellis already half asleep on his feet and Samuel walking with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the stars, Jeremiah fell into step beside Helen and said quietly, "You have remarkable boys." "I know," she said. "They are the best thing I have ever done." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas Beckett must have been a good man. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him carefully, as she always did, with honesty rather than idealization. "He was a good man," she said. "Not a perfect one, but good. He worked hard and he loved us, and he was not cruel, which I know sounds like a low bar, but it is not." "No," Jeremiah agreed. "It is not." "He would have liked you," she said, and then was slightly startled that she had said it, because it was true and she had not meant to let it out yet. Jeremiah was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "That is one of the finest things anyone has said to me." They reached the wagon, and Jeremiah helped Ellis up into the bed, with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that a half-asleep 6-year-old is a delicate and precious object. Samuel climbed up on his own and immediately lay down and pulled his hat over his face. Jeremiah handed Helen up to the wagon seat, and his hand was warm through her glove, and he held on for just a half-second longer than strictly necessary, not in an inappropriate way, but in a way that was deliberate and careful, a question asked without words. Helen let him hold her hand for that half-second. That was her answer. She drove home through the spring dark, the boys asleep behind her, and she thought about Jeremiah Brenner and his questions and his clear eyes and the way he had crouched down to Ellis's level without a second thought. And she told herself, as sternly as she could manage, that a woman in her position, a widow with 2 children and a bread route and a borrowed wagon, should not be building castles. And then she thought about the way he had said, "That is one of the finest things anyone has said to me," and she thought about the half-second, and she thought that perhaps the stern voice in her head was not entirely trustworthy. The weeks deepened into summer. The rail camp contract ran smoothly. Helen had expanded her baking operation, using a larger oven that she had arranged through a complex negotiation with Mrs. Hargrove involving home repairs and the use of Helen's garden, and the Crossroads stand continued every morning. Samuel had refined his ledger system to the point where he could tell Helen not just what they had earned, but what they were likely to earn in the coming week based on traffic patterns, which the boy tracked with a series of small marks on a separate page. Ellis had decided that he was in charge of quality control, which meant he tasted everything and occasionally ate more than his official duties required. Jeremiah continued to come to the Crossroads most mornings, and the questions had evolved. They were less about the bread now, which had been thoroughly covered in the earlier weeks, and more about everything else about Missouri and her childhood, about what she had wanted before she married Thomas, about what she read when she had time. "Not enough," she said, because the evenings were long on baking, but she loved a good novel when she could get one, about what she was afraid of. That last question came one morning in late June, when the heat was already building by 8 o'clock, and the sky had a white, shimmering quality that promised a hot day. She had asked him what he meant by it, and he had said simply, "I want to know you, Helen, not just the baker at the Crossroads, you." She had looked at him for a long moment, at his sunburned face and his patient eyes, and she had said, "I am afraid of not being enough, of the boys growing up needing things I cannot give them. I am afraid of another winter with insufficient firewood and insufficient flour. I am afraid of wanting things that a woman in my position should not want." He had listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something she had come to count on. Then he said, "What things are those, the things you should not want?" She had not answered right away. She had sold a loaf to a passing settler and made change and watched the wagon roll on, and then she said, "Company, steady company, someone to talk to at the end of the day who is not 9 or 6. Jeremiah had said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I would like to be that person if you would let me." It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal of anything formal. It was something more honest than either of those things. It was a man saying, plainly and with full knowledge of what he was saying, that he wanted to be in her life in a deliberate way. Helen felt the heat of the morning on her face and the coins in her apron pocket and the particular weight of her own heart, and she said, "I think I would like that too." That evening, Jeremiah came to the house for the first time. Not invited for supper, not yet, but he had a legitimate reason. He had mended a piece of her fence on the way past, he said, because he had noticed it was leaning and it was simple enough to fix. And he brought the tools back to the barn and stood in her yard in the long evening light, and they talked for over an hour on the porch step, while Samuel read inside and Ellis chased fireflies in the yard, with the absolute conviction that tonight was the night he was going to catch one. They talked about Illinois and Missouri, about what either of them knew about the way things were changing in Kansas, about the cattle business, and whether it would be the same in another 10 years, about a book she had read 3 years ago that he had not read but wanted to, about Ellis and the fireflies and the way children approached impossible tasks with more faith than adults ever managed to muster. When the evening had gone fully dark and the fireflies were too few to chase and Ellis had given up and come to sit on the step between them with his head leaning against his mother's arm, Jeremiah stood to go and said good night in a way that included all 3 of them, and that felt, Helen thought, like the most natural thing. After he rode away into the dark, Ellis said, without lifting his head from her arm, "I like him." "Do you?" Helen said. "He named Red after me," Ellis said, which was not entirely accurate but which had a kind of emotional logic that Helen could not argue with. She put the boys to bed and stood alone in her kitchen in the lamplight, her hands around a cup of tea she had made and was not really drinking, and she let herself think about Jeremiah Brenner without the stern voice for a while, just let the thoughts go where they went, and what they found there was warmth, a genuine and encompassing warmth, the kind she had thought she might not feel again. Summer brought both good things and difficult ones, as it generally did. The rail camp contract was performing beyond what Helen had projected. Calhoun had extended the order to 40 loaves per delivery after the first month, and she had hired a girl from town, a 14-year-old named Polly whose family needed the income, to help with the early morning baking on delivery days. The Crossroads stand was thriving. Samuel had begun talking about whether they could add pies, and Helen was genuinely considering it. But there was also a drought in July that frightened every farmer and rancher in the county, a dry, burning stretch of 6 weeks that cracked the earth and turned the creek east of town into a series of shallow pools and made everyone short-tempered and worried. Helen's flour supply became a concern. Prices went up when supply went down, and the railroads adjusted their shipping rates in ways that seemed calibrated specifically to cause maximum inconvenience to people who could least afford it. There was a conversation with Calhoun about whether the rail camp might have access to grain supplies at a better rate, which Calhoun looked into and partially resolved. And throughout this period, Jeremiah was present in a way that was practical and consistent and not overbearing. He brought firewood when the supply ran low. He helped negotiate with the feed store on her behalf because he knew the owner from a cattle deal. And he showed up on a Saturday in late July to fix the barn roof, which had developed a leak, with only Samuel's assistance and a cheerful lack of complaint about the heat. Helen brought them water and watched Jeremiah up on the roof with her 9-year-old boy, the two of them talking in an easy way that she could hear fragments of from the yard, something about the angles of shingles, something about red, something that made Samuel laugh in his rare, genuine way. And she sat on the porch step and let herself feel it fully. She was falling in love with Jeremiah Brenner. She had been falling for a while, probably since the moment he had crouched down to Ellis's level and told the truth about grief to a 6-year-old. But there was a particular afternoon quality to the light and to the sound of her son's laughter on the roof with this man, and it made her stop pretending that she was only considering the possibility and admit to herself, clearly and without evasion, that it was simply true. She was terrified by it. She was also, and this surprised her, grateful for it. That evening, when the roof was fixed and Samuel had gone inside and Ellis had fallen asleep early after a day of playing in the diminished but still present creek, Jeremiah sat with Helen on the porch step in the cooling air of the evening, and the silence between them was comfortable and full rather than empty, and after a while he said, "There is something I want to say to you." "Say it then," she said. He turned to look at her in the fading light. He had a smear of tar on his forearm from the roofing work, and his hat was off and his hair was damp from the heat, and he looked, Helen thought, entirely himself, not polished or performed but real, thoroughly and completely real. "I have been coming to that Crossroads every morning for almost 4 months," he said, "and I will be honest with you, the first morning I came back it was not for the bread." "I know," she said. He blinked. "You knew. Samuel told me after the second morning," she said. "He said you asked a lot of questions for somebody who just wanted bread." Jeremiah stared at her for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh startled out of him, open and warm, and she felt it like sunlight. "Your boy is perceptive," he said. "He takes after his father," she said, "and possibly after me." The laughter settled, and he was looking at her again with that quality of attention that she had come to know meant something to her in a place she had thought might be sealed for a long time. "I care about you, Helen," he said. "I care about you in a way that I did not expect and that I would not choose to be without. I care about those boys of yours as well. I am not saying this because I want something from you. I am saying it because you deserve to know it, and because I think you are brave enough to hear it." She looked at him for a long moment. A night bird called from the direction of the creek. Somewhere in the house, Ellis made a small sound in his sleep and settled back into quiet. "I care about you too," she said. "That is the truth of it. I care about you, and it frightens me because the last time I loved someone I lost him, and I am not certain I am built to survive that a second time." "I know," he said. He said it quietly and without dismissing the fear. "I am not going to tell you that I am impossible to lose. I am not. Nobody is, but I can tell you that I intend to be very difficult to lose, and I can tell you that I am not going anywhere." He paused. "Not unless you tell me to." She looked at her hands in her lap and then looked up at him and said, "Do not go anywhere." He reached over and took her hand, not the brief contact of assistance this time, not the half-second of questions, but a full, deliberate holding, his large, weathered hand around hers, and she let him. And it was the simplest and most significant thing that had happened to her since September. They sat like that while the evening finished its work and the stars came out over Kansas, one after another, filling in the dark. August came and the drought broke with a spectacular thunderstorm that everyone in Caldwell Junction stood outside watching, with something close to relief becoming joy. The creek came back. The grass recovered. The farmers began to breathe again. Jeremiah had made an offer on the land east of town, the 3-mile-out parcel with the good grass and the reliable creek, and it had been accepted. and he told Helen about it over breakfast at the hotel dining room one morning, the four of them at their table by the window, and Ellis said, "Does that mean you live here now? For real?" And Jeremiah said, "It means I live here now for real." And Ellis said, "Good," with the complete finality of someone for whom the matter was now resolved. Samuel said without looking up from his eggs, "Are you going to raise cattle?" "I am," Jeremiah said. "How many to start?" Samuel asked. Jeremiah looked at the 9-year-old with an expression of genuine respect. "I am thinking 20 to start. Build up from there." Samuel nodded, apparently satisfied with this business approach. Helen looked across the table at Jeremiah, and he looked back at her, and the look contained everything that had accumulated over the past 4 months. Every question and answer, and Crossroads morning and evening on the porch step and hand held in the dark. And she thought that she was, in the simplest and most accurate terms, happy. Genuinely, fully happy, in a way that did not diminish Thomas or her grief or any of it, but simply existed alongside all of that as something true and present and real. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-August, Jeremiah came to the house and asked to speak with Helen privately, which Helen managed by the simple expedient of sending both boys to help Mrs. Hargrove with her garden, a task Ellis found physically exhausting and morally questionable, but which he accepted because Mrs. Hargrove had a jar of hard candies she gave out with strategic generosity. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee between them, and Jeremiah had his hat in his hands, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, slightly uncertain, not frightened, but engaged in something that mattered so much that the usual ease was briefly replaced by something more careful. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You usually do," she said, and the small smile she gave him was specifically designed to help him, which it did. He almost smiled back. He took a breath. "Helen, I want to marry you. I want to be your husband, and I want to be a father figure to Samuel and Ellis, not their father, because Thomas was their father, and that is not a thing to be replaced, but someone who is there, who is steady, who helps carry what needs to be carried. I have land now, and I am not wealthy, but I am honest, and I work hard, and I love those boys, and I love you." He stopped. "I love you, Helen. I should have started with that." She held on to those words for a moment, "I love you, Helen," and let them settle into the right place, which had been waiting for them longer than she had admitted. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." "Then you will marry me?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He let out a breath that was somewhere between relief and joy, and she laughed at it, at the beautiful honesty of his reaction. And then he was smiling too, and he reached across the table and took her hands in both of his and held them. "I want to talk to the boys first," she said, "before we make it official. They should hear it from me." "Of course," he said immediately. "Whatever you think is right." "And I want Mrs. Hargrove to know before anyone in town," she said. "She will be insufferably smug about it, and she has earned that." Jeremiah looked at her. "What do you mean?" "She told me you were coming back that first morning," Helen said. "When I told her a man had bought all 3 loaves and asked what time I set up, she said, 'That man is not interested in bread, Helen, and you should decide how you feel about that.' I told her she was imagining things." "Was she right?" Jeremiah asked. "She was completely right," Helen said. "She is almost always completely right. It is one of her most irritating qualities." He laughed, and she held his hands across the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved through the window and lay golden on the floor. And she thought that this was what it felt like, when the thing you had been afraid to want turned out to be exactly what it was. That evening she sat the boys down. She had thought carefully about how to do this, had turned it over in her mind all afternoon, and had decided that the best approach with her sons was the direct one, because they were both, in their different ways, people who preferred truth to careful presentation. "I want to tell you both something," she said. They were on the porch, the 3 of them, with the evening coming in soft and warm. "Jeremiah has asked me to marry him, and I said yes. But before anything is decided, I wanted to talk to you both because you are my boys and this affects you and your feelings matter." Samuel looked at her for a long moment with his careful eyes. Then he said, Does this mean he will live here? We would figure that out, Helen said. He has his land now. There are different ways things could be arranged. But he would be our stepfather, Samuel said. Yes, Helen said, if you are all right with that. Samuel was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the yard. He looked back at his mother. He said, he is a good man. He fixed the roof and he did not make it a thing. He is straight with you about things. He paused. Pa would have liked him. I think you said that already, but I think it is true. Helen's throat tightened in a good way. She said, he is a good man. Ellis, who had been sitting with his chin in his hands, said, can I still call him Jeremiah? You can call him whatever you want, Helen said. Ellis thought about this with visible seriousness. I am going to see, he said, which was both perfectly Ellis and somehow the wisest possible answer. She told Mrs. Hargrove the following morning, arriving at the woman's door before the Crossroads run, and Mrs. Hargrove's expression did exactly what Helen had predicted, a satisfied, bright-eyed smugness that she made no effort to conceal, and then she pulled Helen into a brief, strong embrace and said, you deserve this. Do not be a fool and talk yourself out of it. I am not going to, Helen said. Good, said Mrs. Hargrove. I will make you a quilt. The wedding was simple and entirely appropriate to the time and place and people. It was held on a Saturday at the end of September at the small Methodist church on Caldwell Junction's Main Street, which smelled of wood polish and summer-baked dust, and had windows that let in a very specific quality of prairie light that seemed to have been designed with ceremony in mind. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cole, who conducted the service with genuine warmth and only slightly more formality than the occasion strictly required, which Helen found endearing. She wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep blue with a narrow white collar that Thomas had liked, but that she had rarely worn because it seemed too good for daily use, and now she understood that was exactly the wrong approach. Jeremiah wore a new coat. She had noticed him purchasing it at Maggart's General Store the week before and had not mentioned it, which she had enjoyed in a private way. And he was freshly shaved, and his hair was combed, and he looked, standing at the front of the church as she walked down the small aisle, as though he was doing the thing he most wanted to do in the world. Samuel stood on Jeremiah's side, having appointed himself to this position without consultation, wearing his best shirt with a seriousness appropriate to bearing witness to something real. Ellis stood beside his mother, holding her hand, and about halfway through the ceremony reached over and took Jeremiah's hand on the other side as well, which caused Reverend Cole to pause and smile, and the gathered assembly, about 30 people, including Sandoval and Pete Havorson and Calhoun and Mrs. Hargrove, to produce a collective sound of pure, uncomplicated warmth. When Reverend Cole said the words and Jeremiah placed the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he had told her was his mother's, passed down from Illinois, and which Helen treasured precisely for that reason, and when he lifted her face to his and kissed her in the particular gentle, certain way that he did everything, Helen felt the full weight of the moment and let it hold her. They were married. That was the fact. Simple and true and enormous. The celebration afterward was at the hotel dining room, which Pete Havorson had arranged to have mostly to themselves for the afternoon, and it involved good food and considerable noise from Ellis, and a conversation between Calhoun and Mrs. Hargrove that appeared to be going very well indeed, and Samuel, at some point in the middle of the afternoon, came and stood next to Jeremiah and said quietly, I am glad you came back that second morning. Jeremiah looked down at him. So am I, he said. More than I can say. You could have just bought bread and left, Samuel said. I thought about it, Jeremiah admitted. But then I would have missed out on knowing you, and that would have been a significant loss. Samuel looked at him steadily, evaluating, and then gave a single nod that Jeremiah somehow understood was precisely the significant endorsement it was. They settled into the life together that had been building toward itself since that first Crossroads morning. Helen continued the bread business. It was hers, she had built it, and Jeremiah had never suggested it should be otherwise. But they arranged the household together on Jeremiah's land, the 3 miles east of the junction with its good grass and reliable creek. The house there was small but sound, and they made it theirs gradually, the way people make homes, through accumulated small choices and particular objects, and the arrangement of furniture in ways that suited the life being lived. Samuel kept his ledger and expanded it. By October, he had convinced Helen to add a third delivery day, and had developed a system for tracking which customers bought what most reliably, which was almost comically sophisticated for a 9-year-old's notebook, but which was entirely effective. Ellis adopted Red as a personal project, visiting the horse daily and conducting what he called training sessions that primarily consisted of Ellis talking to the horse at length while the horse regarded him with patient equine tolerance. Jeremiah told Ellis that Red had improved enormously under his care, which Ellis accepted as fact. Jeremiah worked the land and began building the small herd, the 20 head he had talked about, purchasing carefully and with an eye for quality over quantity. He rode the fence lines early and came home in the evenings and sat at the table while Helen finished the baking records and they talked, the way they had always talked, with genuine attention and honest words and frequent questions. And sometimes they just sat in the comfortable quiet of two people who are glad to be in the same room. There were hard things too, because life was always a combination, particularly on the frontier in 1878. There was a winter storm in January that took 2 of Jeremiah's cattle and damaged a section of fence, and required 3 days of hard work in bitter cold to put right. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Aldous who claimed the south boundary of Jeremiah's land ran 6 feet further than the deed specified, which required a trip to Wichita and the services of a surveyor and a lawyer, and consumed 2 weeks of aggravation before being resolved in Jeremiah's favor. There was a morning in February when Helen got word that the rail camp was closing, the spur line had been completed, and the workers were moving on, and she lost the Calhoun contract, which was a significant blow to the income. That evening she sat at the table and looked at the numbers and thought through the options, and Jeremiah sat across from her and let her think and then said, "The rail camp is gone, but the town is bigger than it was when you started. The hotel dining room wants more than you can supply, and there are 2 new families that have set up homesteads north of here." She looked up at him. "You have been thinking about this." "I have been thinking about this," he said. "For how long?" "Since I heard Calhoun was closing up," he said. "Which was 3 weeks ago before you knew." She stared at him. "You knew 3 weeks ago and you did not tell me." "I wanted to have the alternatives ready before I worried you with the news," he said, somewhat defensively. She held her look for a moment and then said, "Jeremiah Brenner, if we are going to be honest partners in this life, you tell me the difficult news when you hear it and we figure out the alternatives together." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been corrected and knows it is fair. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry." "Do not be sorry." "Just do it right next time," she said. "Yes," he said, "and then the alternatives really are solid." She allowed a small smile. "Show me," she said, "the alternatives were solid." By spring, the bread business had shifted fewer large single contracts but broader distribution. The hotel expanded, 2 boarding houses, a new family running a small restaurant that had opened in March. Samuel had mapped it all out in his ledger with the calm confidence of a young man who expected the numbers to work if you were systematic about it. And they did work, not the same as before but differently well, in a way that was more resilient against any single change. Spring brought new things, including the announcement that Helen was expecting, which she told Jeremiah one March evening after supper when the boys were in bed, and the house was quiet, and she said it plainly because she had learned that was the best way. And his face did the thing that it did when something reached him very deeply. He went very still and his eyes grew bright, and he said with a kind of careful wonder, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Is it?" he started. "November," she said. "The doctor thinks November." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same gesture that had meant so much on a porch step in summer, and he said, "Helen." "I know," she said. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, because he always asked the real question. She considered it honestly. A new child. A new life with Jeremiah on this land, with Samuel and Ellis and the bread business and Red and Mrs. Hargrove and all of it. "Yes," she said. "I am genuinely happy about it." He was around the table before she finished the sentence, and he held her there in the kitchen in the lamplight, and she felt his arms around her and the warmth of him, and she thought that there were certain moments that contain everything you need to know about whether a life is going well, and this was one of them. Telling the boys required its own calibrations. Samuel received the news with a long, thoughtful pause and then said, "That will change a lot of the household logistics," which made both Jeremiah and Helen struggle not to laugh, and then he said, "I am glad, though," and the genuineness of it was unmistakable. Ellis said, "Is it a boy or a girl?" And when told they did not yet know, said, "I want a brother, another brother, then I will not be the youngest." He thought about it. "Actually, a sister might be interesting. I do not know any sisters." He thought about it more. "Either way is fine, I want to name it." "We will talk about names," Helen said. "I am going to call it something good," Ellis said, with the certainty of someone who does not yet know that naming rights are typically subject to negotiation. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The rains came at the right times. Jeremiah's herd had grown to 30 head and was healthy. The bread business had found its new shape and was working within it, and the Crossroads stand continued 2 mornings a week. Helen had reduced it from every day, distributing her time across the expanded delivery routes, but she had kept those 2 mornings because she loved them, and because Samuel had pointed out correctly that the Crossroads was where new customers found them. So it was marketing as much as commerce. One morning in July, on a Crossroads morning, with the sky the particular summer blue that made everything look clear and far away, a woman stopped her wagon and bought 2 loaves and looked at Helen's setup with the assessing eyes of someone who understood business and said, "You have been here a while, I take it." "Since spring of '78, Helen said. "You do all the baking yourself?" "My husband helps when his schedule allows," Helen said, and enjoyed the simple normality of that sentence. "And I have help on the heavy delivery days." The woman, her name was Clara Whitmore. It emerged, recently arrived from Ohio with her husband, who was setting up a dry goods store on the main street, bought the bread and talked with Helen for a quarter of an hour, and left with a standing order for a dozen loaves a week delivered to the new store. Helen told Jeremiah about it that evening, and he said, "You negotiated a standing order at the side of the road between selling to travelers and watching Ellis talk to Red." "I did," she said. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Both things are true," he said, which was accurate. In September, Jeremiah completed the addition to the house, 2 more rooms, which they would need with the new baby coming and with Samuel and Ellis growing at the rate that boys grew. And he did it with help from a man from town named Gaines, who was a carpenter by trade. And the 2 of them worked for 3 weeks and produced something solid and well-made that fit the existing house without looking tacked on, which Jeremiah said was a matter of planning carefully from the start. Samuel turned 10 in September, a fact he treated with considerable gravity, and Helen made him a cake with the last of the summer's honey, and Jeremiah gave him a small folding knife of excellent quality and a notebook that was larger and better made than his current ledger. And Samuel looked at both gifts and said, "Thank you," in a way that meant he was genuinely moved but was not going to be dramatic about it. Ellis turned 7 in October and wanted only one thing, which was a saddle small enough to fit a boy his size, because he had decided that if Red was going to be his horse, he should be able to ride Red properly. And Jeremiah found him one at the saddle maker's in town, and had it fitted, and Ellis's reaction was everything that Samuel's reaction was: not loud, immediate, whole-bodied joy that he did not contain or moderate in any way, which was, Helen thought, one of the great pleasures of knowing Ellis. November came, and it came like November in Kansas, sharp and clear and cold at the edges, and on a night in the middle of the month when the stars were very bright and the wind was from the north, their son was born. He was healthy and loud and had, from the first moments, a look of determined engagement with the world that the doctor, who had been out in the cold for 2 hours, and deserved his fee, declared was a very good sign. Jeremiah held him in the lamplight while Helen rested, and she watched her husband's face as he held this new person, this additional weight and love and responsibility that they had made together, and she had no words that were adequate to the moment, so she did not try to find them. "What do we name him?" Jeremiah asked. "I thought Thomas," Helen said, "for his grandfather, if you are all right with that." Jeremiah looked at her over the baby's small head, and the look said everything about who he was, that he understood what that name meant and honored it rather than feeling diminished by it, that he was large enough in his heart for all of it to coexist without conflict. "Thomas is a fine name," he said. "But Ellis said he gets to help," Helen reminded him. Jeremiah smiled. "What does Ellis want to add?" "He said the middle name should be Red," Helen said. Jeremiah looked at the baby. He looked at Helen. He said, "Thomas Red Brenner is perhaps not the most dignified name in the state of Kansas." "I know," Helen said. "I suggested we could make Red a nickname, and Ellis said that was not the same thing and I was missing the point." They decided on Thomas James Brenner, James being Jeremiah's father's name, and they told Ellis that Red could be a family nickname for Thomas, used only by Ellis, and Ellis accepted this with the generosity of someone who has won enough of the argument to be gracious about the rest. Samuel came and looked at his new half-brother with the careful eyes he brought to everything important and said, "He is smaller than I expected." "He will grow," Jeremiah said. "I know," Samuel said. "I just expected more of him already." He reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers closed around it in that automatic way newborns have, and Samuel's face, his careful, watchful, controlled face, went entirely open with something that might have been wonder. He did not say anything. He just stood there with his finger held by the baby's grip, and Helen thought that she had never seen her older son so completely unguarded, and she was glad for it. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was cold but manageable. They had wood and food, and the house was well built for warmth, and Thomas James was a noisy but thriving addition to the household. Jeremiah had brought on a hand for the cattle operation, a young man named Decker who was quiet and competent, and who regarded Ellis's authority over Red with a diplomatic neutrality. And the herd was doing well through the cold months. Helen baked and delivered and ran her business and fed her family, and in the evening sometimes she looked around the kitchen table at all of them. Samuel with his ledger, Ellis with whatever project currently had his attention, Jeremiah drinking coffee and reading the newspaper he had delivered from Wichita, and baby Thomas in the cradle near the stove. And she thought about that morning in March of 1878, when she had loaded 8 loaves into Mrs. Hargrove's wagon and driven to the Crossroads with 58 cents as the goal and survival as the ambition. She had survived. She had done considerably more than survive. One evening in February, when Thomas was 3 months old and the winter was beginning to feel long, Jeremiah put down his newspaper and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking today about the first morning I saw you at that Crossroads," he said. "I had come east on business for Dunmore and I was heading back through the junction, and I saw you there with the bread on the crate and the sign you had written, and something about it stopped me. I do not know exactly what it was. Maybe it was the directness of it. You had something to offer and you were offering it on your own terms and you were not making it into more than what it was." He paused. I turned Red around. I had already passed the Crossroads and I turned him around. Helen looked up at him. "I did not know that," she said. "I did not tell you," he said. "But I turned him around and I bought all 3 loaves and I asked you what time you set up. And riding away, I thought that I was going to have to think carefully about whether going back was a thing I should do. And I thought about it for about 30 seconds and decided the answer was yes without question, and went back to the junction and booked myself another week at the hotel." Helen put down the stocking she had been mending. She said, "You booked yourself another week at the hotel after 30 seconds of thinking." "The thinking was very clear," he said. She looked at him across the table, this man who had ridden past and turned back, who had bought every loaf she had and come back the next morning with questions, who had crouched down to her boy's level and told the truth about grief, and named a horse Red, and fixed a barn roof, and mended a fence, and introduced her to a rail camp foreman, and made her laugh and asked her real questions, and held her hand on a porch step in the summer dark, and stood at the front of a church with bright eyes and gave his mother's ring and sat steady through every hard thing, and held a new baby in lamplight and said Thomas is a fine name. She said, "I am very glad you turned around." Yes. He reached across the table for her hand. "So am I," he said. "Every morning I am glad." The spring of 1880 came in warm and fast, and Helen was at the Crossroads on the first good morning of it, with 12 loaves on the crate and Samuel beside her, with his ledger and Ellis on red properly, with his small saddle, riding in slow circles around the crossroads with enormous satisfaction, and Jeremiah had ridden out with them, and tied Red to the fence post, and stood beside Helen in the morning light. "Good morning," she said to the first traveler who stopped, a young man with a tired horse and hopeful eyes heading west. "Good morning," said the young man. "Is that bread fresh?" "Baked this morning," Helen said. He bought 2 loaves and rode on, and more came after him. A family, a drover, 2 brothers who were looking for work north of town, old Sandoval who had never stopped coming by and who still paid 3 cents more than the price. And the morning moved the way good mornings moved, with purpose and exchange and the specific satisfaction of a thing offered and a thing received. Jeremiah bought his bread last, the way he always did on Crossroads mornings now, letting the paying customers go first, and he set his coins on the corner of the crate with the same deliberateness he had used on the very first morning, and she handed him the bread wrapped in the cloth, and he said, "You have a question," she laughed. "I always have questions. You taught me that." "Ask it then," he said. She looked at him in the morning light, at her husband, at the father of Thomas James, and the figure steady as a fence post in Samuel's life, and the person Ellis considered half his own in some complicated 6.5-year-old logic, at the man who had turned his horse around. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her at the crossroads, at Ellis on red and Samuel with his ledger, and the Kansas plain stretching away in every direction under the enormous spring sky. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said. No qualification to that, just exactly that. She believed him. She believed him because he had always told her the truth, even the difficult pieces of it, and because the look on his face was the look she had learned over 2 years of close attention to be the one that meant he meant it entirely. "Good," she said. "So am I." The road came and went all morning, carrying its traffic north and south and east and west, the way the crossroads always had and always would, bringing strangers and familiar faces, commerce and chance, the steady business of people going places and needing things along the way. And Helen Brenner, who had been Helen Beckett on a hard morning in 1878 with 8 loaves of bread and 58 cents as her horizon, stood at her crate in the morning light with her family around her, and sold her bread, and answered her questions, and felt, all the way through, the uncomplicated and extraordinary fact of a life that was full. Thomas James grew and thrived and turned out to have Ellis's grin and Samuel's eyes, which Helen called the best possible combination, and Jeremiah said he also had Helen's stubbornness, which Helen disputed, and which the evidence fully supported. The herd grew to 50 head by 1881, and Jeremiah brought on a second hand. Samuel turned 13 that year and was running the bread business records with a sophistication that made the men at the bank look at his books with surprised respect. Ellis at 10 was a capable rider and had decided he was going to be a cattleman, which Jeremiah took seriously and encouraged with appropriate mentorship. Mrs. Hargrove attended all the important occasions, birthdays, holidays, the various small celebrations of the turning of the year, and her smug satisfaction at the way things had developed never entirely diminished, which Helen forgave her for because she had been right, and because the quilt she had made for the wedding was the finest piece of domestic craftsmanship Helen had ever seen, and she kept it on the bed and planned to keep it there forever. Sandoval, who had become something between a regular customer and a family friend over the years, came through one autumn with news that he was setting up a trading operation in Wichita and asked Helen if she wanted a contract to supply the operation there. And she negotiated it at the Crossroads in October of 1881, while Jeremiah listened from the fence post with an expression of quiet pride that he did not bother to conceal. That evening she told him she had closed the deal, and he said, "Helen Beckett, who sold bread at the Crossroads to feed her boys, has built herself a proper business." "Helen Brenner," she corrected, though she smiled when she said it. "Both," he said. "You are both." She thought about that. She was both the woman who had loaded that wagon in the dark in March of 1878 and the woman who stood here now, and the line between those two people was not a break but a continuation, built from flour and coins and Crossroads mornings and questions asked and answered, and a man who had turned his horse around. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat on their porch on their land in the Kansas evening with the sounds of the house behind them. Thomas making the specific kind of noise that meant he was not quite asleep, Ellis arguing a point to Samuel about something that would be fully explained in the morning, the tick of the stove cooling, and the wide, indifferent, magnificent sky above them that had been there for all of it, every morning and evening and hard middle of the night. And she thought, this is the life. This is it. Not the life she had planned or the life she had imagined when she was young, but the life she had made day by day, loaf by loaf, question by question, hand held on a porch step, a ring placed, a baby held in lamplight, a man who turned his horse around. This life, hers, theirs. The mockingbird in the cottonwood at the corner of the yard was doing something complicated in the evening air, and the grass along the fence line moved in the easy way of grass that is not worried about anything, and Jeremiah said, "What are you thinking?" She looked at him. She said, "I am thinking that I am grateful." "For what specifically?" he asked, because he always wanted the specific. She squeezed his hand. "For all of it," she said, "every single part." He looked at her for a long moment, the man with the clear eyes and the patient horse and the questions that had changed everything, and he said, "So am I," and the evening settled around them, and the stars came out over Kansas the way they always did, one at a time, and then all at once, and the Crossroads a mile to the west was empty in the dark, waiting for morning.